Hello, bookhounds. If you love sniffing out a mystery series like I do, let me introduce Patricia Wentworth and her amateur sleuth, Miss Silver, who has been compared to her contemporary fictional detective, Miss Marple. I first came across a lovely 80s era paperback of one of these books in either a thrift store or the library book sale, and I really liked it. Since then, I've managed to get my hands on 11 more books in the series from one of my favorite local used bookstores over the last few months. These books are not hard to find, they are quite inexpensive, and I wanted to share them with you because I was enjoying them a lot, and I thought you might like them too, especially if you like a more classic old school mystery. I also think that Patricia Wentworth isn't as well known as some of the bigger players of her own era, like Agatha Christie or Dorothy Sayers. So if you've exhausted some of those authors, you might be happy to find this one that's maybe new to you. So Patricia Wentworth was the pen name of Dora Amy Turnbull, born in 1877, and she died in 1961. She was the daughter of General Edmund Ells and Claire Lady Ells, and her books are set very much in the world that she knew and grew up in the sort of middle to upper class Britain, the country homes and intrigues of small towns and those character types and families. The kind of setting and types that would become the setting of a lot of cozy mysteries. Something that I found quite touching was that she chose the pen name Wentworth because it was her loved stepson's middle name and he had died in World War I. Her first book came out in 1910 and she wrote over 60 books, 32 of which are in the Miss Silver mystery series. The first one in the series is The Grey Mask, which came out in 1928, and the last was The Girl in the Cellar, which came out in 1961. Same year as her death. So she wrote her whole life right up until her death. Patricia Wentworth was a member of the famous Detection Club, a club for respected crime fiction authors founded in 1930, and that's still active today. Its members included her contemporaries Agatha Christie, Dorothy Sayers, and G.K. Chesterton, amongst others. Unlike her more famous compatriots, there isn't a biography on Patricia Wentworth, and I actually found it quite hard to get a little bit more information about her and her life beyond the basic information. So, I haven't really talked about this yet. Miss Silver mysteries are considered golden age mysteries, so I'm going to digress a little bit here to explain what that means. I feel like I should get my, get some printouts and red string and start sticking them on my living room wall here to kind of give you a sense of what all this means, but bear with me. I'll try and keep it a little bit short. But before the 1920s, there were a few forays into mystery fiction, most of which originally had a bit of a leaning into more of the Gothic fiction oeuvre. That's a nice word. With Edgar Allan Poe's story, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, often being seen or said to be the first modern detective story, and that was in 1841. This era is sort of called the Victorian period of mysteries sometimes, and it also gave us the famous Sherlock Holmes by Arthur Conan Doyle around the turn of the century. So the first stories were coming out in the 1880s. So then in the 20s and until around the 1940s, we have what's often called the Golden Age, which is where, Mary Allingham, Niall Marsh, Rex Stout, Agatha Christie, Dorothy Sayers. I feel like I'm repeating their names so much. But this is the classic era of the detective novel, with the detective using intellect over forensics or that kind of thing to solve a mystery. And these generally functioned like a puzzle for the reader. This era often featured what the Detection Club called fair play, which is the rule that the reader should be given all of the clues that the detective has so that they could feasibly figure out who the killer is. Personally, I think Agatha Christie sometimes sort of bent these rules close to breaking in the best possible way, but that would be another video for another time. This golden era was mostly British authors, or mostly refers to British authors, and developed features that would later become tropes of cozy mysteries, most especially the citizen or amateur detective like our Miss Silver or Poirot or Father Brown. These are rarely gruesome, not particularly gruesome, and they're often quite domestic in scope or in some ways. Over the pond in the US, for a little contrast, the 20s to the 50s is often called the hard-boiled era, with writers like Dashiell Hammett, Raymond Chandler, James M. Cain, Mickey Spillane, those kinds of stories. These were darker, grittier, more cynical, often had sort of quippy writing, which is very clever, and had crimes that showed the darker side of life, moral corruption, sometimes loose women. They're often quite funny to read. They often have really good sort of snappy dialogue, that kind of thing. Sometimes we get the private detective, a man left nihilistic after experiencing the Second World War, characters like Sam Spade and Philip Marlowe. I actually really love these books too, but for very different reasons, and they're definitely not cozy. So then after that, from the 40s to the 70s, we get a new post-war era with writers like P.D. James, Josephine Tey, and the style changed to become less of a cozy puzzle or even that stylized cynicism of the hard-boiled to being more based in realism. We start to see the police procedural type story emerge, which I cover on here quite a lot actually. More forensics are used, more of those types of clues, more technical details and technology, more police work than private citizens, that kind of thing. And there was a shift away from the formulaic style of the earlier mysteries, a greater interest in the psychological, the modus operandi and motives. And then from the 80s onwards, we have what's called the modern era, which is typified by authors like Ruth Rendell, Ian Rankin, Joe Nesbo, Louise Penny. And the detective story can now be blurred or mixed with other genres like thriller, cozy, psychological suspense, and obviously a lot more variations on that. Realism, grit, darker plot, forensics I mentioned, police procedure. Often you'll see now that there will be actual, police experts that are sort of used to get that realism. And the influence of the technological age have really changed the face of the mystery novel as well. And so into that mix, we also have the emergence of a subgenre called the cozy mystery, which kind of comes up a lot. It's very, very popular. And that created tropes out of a lot of the golden era's features. So they were sort of trying to hark back to that older time, older style, that puzzle type of book. And there's sort of variations. One source said the 60s, another said the 80s. Is sort of when this started to emerge, but I would say the 80s is probably pretty accurate. And that's just big business today, these cozy mysteries. Some of these are super formulaic, gimmicky, and sort of very by rote kind of thing. Things like bakers who solve cooking-themed crimes for just several books in a row, and it's sort of things happen in the same order. And others are quite mainstream and popular, like Number One Ladies Detective Agency, which I really enjoy. And I've mentioned before the Cat series, the Cat Who series, where a cat helps solve the murders and the crimes. These often have that small town or country home location, amateur detective, not a lot of gore or scary themes or adult themes kind of thing. And they usually have a sense of charm and humor to them, a sort of all's well that ends well at the end. So the reason I kind of mention that is because I think it's important to differentiate between golden era mysteries and cozy mysteries. If you like cozy mysteries, you will probably like golden era mysteries, but there are significant differences. So there you go. A brief history for you. Miss Silver is definitely golden age or golden era. Her first Miss Silver book came out in 1928, which is peak golden era time. The books lasted until the first years of the 1960s. And while they interestingly reflect their changing time, they always remain kind of the same in their style and formula and sort of basic outlook. So Miss Silver and the formula of her books, or the tropes of her books. So to get down to it, unlike Agatha Christie, Patricia Wentworth's books feel less innovative and more formulaic in some ways. There are certain elements or motifs that repeat and are used in different ways. And yet, reading these, I felt like they all had their own different atmosphere that was created really well, their different social circles, and the characters felt interesting and really well realized to me. So in description, you might think that they sound similar, and in ways they are. They all felt unique and fun to me as I was reading them. Also, there are stories where Miss Silver appears early on and throughout the novel, and she's more of a main character. And then there are others where she doesn't appear until part the way in or quite late in the narrative, or sometimes more of a side character. So that kind of shifts around. The formula comes more from key things used in different ways rather than an actual plot formula. So who is Miss Silver? Maud Silver's backstory is that she started out in life as a governess, and she did some teaching in her younger years as well. This vocation was one of the very few careers open to women in that era, of her social class anyway, and compared to the bright young things of the 20s and 30s that she's surrounded by in these stories, she's seen as a bit of a throwback to an earlier time, a sort of recognizable type of person, but one that sometimes people are a little bit surprised to sort of see her because she seems to come from a different age. She dresses a little bit out of fashion, and her clothing is kind of described in a way that I think hints at pre-World War I or maybe even Edwardian. One of the children she taught was Frank Abbott, and he's a recurring figure in the books. He came from a wealthy background, and he ended up working for Scotland Yard as a detective, and this became an entry point for Miss Silver to take an interest in investigating cases and that kind of thing, leading her to be able to work as a consultant. So I love this because there are moments in this book where she's maybe in her house or somewhere like that, and she's just sort of looking around herself and is grateful that she was able to leave a type of work that she didn't enjoy. She didn't really love teaching. You get the impression that she enjoyed aspects of it and liked her students, but it wasn't like her calling in life. And so now she has a comfortable and happy retirement. She can look forward to her older age. And this is something that the book lets us know. A happy retirement in comfortable circumstances was not common for a retired governess. They did not get paid very well. They did not necessarily have the means to have a nice nest egg, that kind of thing. So I like this. I think this is a really nice thing when it comes up in the books, that she's created a small business for herself and created this life, and just making that point of like thinking about what happens to people in those kinds of careers. Miss Silver often wears a favored bog oak brooch. I'm not really sure what a bog oak is. I should have looked that up. It's shaped like a rose and it features a pearl, so this is often brought up. She's often knitting baby items for her many family members, old pupils and their babies, and sometimes characters she's helped in previous books, which is quite fun. She has more nieces and nephews and connections than Jessica Fletcher, so that's really saying something. She almost always quotes her favorite poet Tennyson somewhere at the start of the book or sometimes throughout, and she tells her clients that they must be comfortable with her finding the truth of the case, and this may not be necessarily what they might want to hear, or like she's going to find out the truth, not just help them get out of a situation kind of thing. Her being an older woman from a previous era works for her in a few ways, or she makes it work for her in a few ways. She can put people at ease because she's non-threatening. She can put them on their best behavior because of her sort of governessly bossiness. She's not intimidated by people. And her work has left her with an understanding of people's psychology and social interactions as well. She can also stay in the houses where the cases are unfolding, unlike a police detective, if she wants to. Sometimes she sort of does this in an undercover way, which is quite fun. And while she's there, she tends to go a little overlooked and unnoticed, which means she often gets little bits of information that a usual type of detective would not be privy to. Some of my favorite moments are the way she quietly intimidates some of the men just by looking at them and sort of taking them back to the times where they were in awe of like the matriarch or school teacher, kind of they're grown men, and she kind of reduces them to being a little boy again. It's quite funny. There's a bit of humor in these books a lot of the time, actually. While on the surface, she's a little old lady detective, perhaps, and that's very cozy mystery-esque and par for the course of the time, she's also a bit of a feminist icon. If you thought feminism started in like the 70s or something, you might find some of Miss Silver's attitudes make you think again. Also, watch out for the little cough that is one of her tics. Sometimes it will let you know that she's had an idea or maybe noticed a clue. I think this cough is meant to be a little sort of vocal noise, like a clearing of the throat type of noise. Amusingly, at the start of the Catherine Wheel, the author put a note in response to readers to let us know that Miss Silver does not have an illness. It's not that kind of cough. So clearly some readers were concerned about our heroine's health. They need not have worried, though time passes in these stories reflecting their publication years and different sort of social context comes up. Miss Silver is indefatigable and she never ages. So, I've mentioned a few times these books have a sort of tropes or motifs that are repeated. So this is your Miss Silver bingo card. Take a sip of tea or a bite of a cookie or something like that every time one of these things come up. These are often in these books, but just moved around and used in really different and creative ways. So these books don't really feel, they can be a little samey, but they're also sort of not samey. I found them all to be quite satisfyingly similar, but all quite different. So there's always a romance, a young couple impacted by the murder in some way. Will they get together by the end of the book? Is kind of one of the questions. So that's number one. Number two, cousins who marry is not uncommon. I think that was just something that wasn't that uncommon in the time period, honestly. Number three would be a small town in the UK is often the location. Sometimes London is used, but it still has a kind of cozy feel to it. A country home or a family estate is often a frequent location as well, like that country manor kind of thing. I love this. This is one of my personal favorite mystery locations. So that's probably one of the reasons I enjoy this series so much. Number four, different social classes and types in these stories, and they're all sympathetically portrayed unless they're bad guys. UK society is really ruled by social class, but in these books we have different walks of life that are meeting and that care about each other, which is nice. They can be friends or different things like that. Catherine Wheel and the Case of William Smith are really great cases in point of this. But yeah, this probably reflects the governess's social position, really, like being not of the servant class, but also an employee of the family. So Miss Silver can move between the two worlds. I think in reality, it was more a case of being stuck in a lonely no man's land of not maybe being of the same social class as the family, but being their employee. So you don't really fit with the servants or the family. So I guess this is kind of subversive or an egalitarian element of the stories. Either way, shopkeepers, servants, farmers, merchants, lords and ladies all appear in these books, and they tend to have a unique voice and be well drawn as well, with slightly different concerns and preoccupations and vocabulary sort of based on their background. I really liked how that was done. Yeah, I think this also may reflect the changing face of Great Britain in the 20s and 40s as people started to live in new ways. And a lot of those class divides were really breaking down. So this is kind of just a really interesting thing to see in a popular fiction of the time, this kind of changing. Number five, I mentioned the gentle humor in these books. Miss Silver will often be kind of annoying to the police chief in charge of a case. Sometimes to Frank Abbott if he's present. He'll be kind of amused by this, or he'll say little things to get a reaction from Miss Silver. I think in one book he says something like, why don't you just, oh, you're here, like, why don't you just tell us who did it now, since you probably already know, like kind of that kind of thing. Sometimes he will deliberately misquote Tennyson just to sort of annoy her. And I love this. It's very loving. It kind of reminds me of like a pleasant family relationship. Yeah, and this is very much in a different type of family system than the Victorian family system of sort of really respecting your elders. Frank respects her, but he also has a comfortable, loving relationship with her, which is just really nice. Sometimes the author will gently make fun of a type of person, like the type of person who corners you at the dinner table and tells long, boring stories and won't let you get away from them, or somebody just being woefully out of touch, that kind of thing. There's also sometimes a deep sleeper who just sleeps through the murders entirely, or the main characters might have a little playful banter with each other, and I think this gives the stories a nice tone. I mean, this would be the era of that sort of quick fire screwball type dialogue in movies and stuff like that. So I think it kind of reflects a little bit of the sort of humor and that kind of thing of the time. So number 6, lawyers and money and wills. These are, I think this was present or a factor in almost all of the books I read. I found this really interesting, and I kind of wondered what this reflected. Like, was it just popular with readers, and so she kept it in there as sort of like a familiar point of her books, like a kind of something she could return to? Or was there something that happened in the author's own life, or something that she saw a lot that this was kind of reflecting, reflecting back her experience or something like that? I don't know. But either way, we have solicitors or family members mismanaging or misappropriating money. Sometimes wills are written and rewritten, lost and found, and fortune hunters want to marry for money. These are all kind of the way they're used, this kind of wills and lawyers and things. Even though this idea is used constantly, it's used in a different way each time. It's kind of like the MacGuffin, and then everything else is different. So I like this. Sometimes it did feel like a throwback to some Victorian novels in a way, like something out of Wilkie Collins, maybe. So I guess inheriting money was probably a huge preoccupation in that time period, maybe. And also this kind of winning the lottery or Cinderella type story is perennially popular. So it may not be anything more deep than that. Number 7, sometimes we have women being pursued or pressured by men to marry them for their own nefarious purposes. This may be a little more aggressive, sometimes more subtle. From my reading, this seemed more common in the earlier books than in the later ones, but it adds a level of drama and tension. Sometimes we get fashion descriptions and little outfit descriptions. This is used to let us know something about the character wearing them, maybe their social class, their taste, or if they were sort of glamorous or plain, that kind of thing. But for me, I love fashion from different time periods, so I kind of loved these descriptions. Number 9, war. There's a mention of the First World War and its impact in the earlier books. And then, of course, in the 30s, there's the looming threat of war. The 40s era books are really interesting. They have a lot of just sort of in the background of the books, what it's like living through the war in the 40s. Bombings, changes in finances, breakdown of social classes and that kind of thing, PTSD and shell shock, children being sent away from London. And there's also things like little things that you wouldn't think of, like bombing air raid shelters and houses having their foundations destabilized by bombing. So those are all interesting things. They're kind of a contemporary source, basically. So I just found that really interesting. And number 10, women working. What kind of work they did, different eras, and what they did during the war. All social classes of women have worked throughout history in different ways. And these books just kind of have that and talk about that because some of the main characters are women. It's a book written by a woman. So yeah, I really found that interesting. And that's kind of includes like what women did in the home as well as out of it. So just something that I was often interested by. So as you can probably tell, I really enjoyed reading these. I found they were cozy enough, not too long, and had enough tension and intrigue to keep me turning pages. They don't have Agatha Christie's finesse, cleverness, and variety. Maybe. And they aren't Dorothy Sayers' sort of intellectual exercises. But I mean, I didn't sit there guessing the ending every time. And I liked all the different characters and situations. Every family is different. It has its own psychology and tensions in this book. And I liked the little side romance sort of plots that were in there. I also feel like they varied a lot in the way the murder may happen early or late in the book, Miss Silver being more of a main character or less sometimes. So that kind of plotting felt really different every time, even as those sort of motifs were used over again. Yes, they're neat little stories and they have style. So a quick note, these books are from a previous century at this point. So perhaps it goes without saying that there may be things in them that are offensive to some readers. So if you do want to pick these up, obviously just be aware of that. I didn't write down, there were a couple of things where I was like, oh yeah, that's like not great. They were minor things. I didn't write them down. Maybe I should have, I don't know. But there weren't a lot of them, surprisingly enough. Miss Silver is fairly progressive, but only for her time period, not by today's standards. Okay, so I read 12 of these books. Let's talk about them. So number 1, I got my hands on Grey Mask, which is the first one from 1928. In a dark house at night, Charles Moray overhears shady members of a criminal organization talking about a murder and a missing inheritance. There's your inheritance, up front and center. And not long after that, Lord Standing dies. Charles would go to the police, but he knows one of the voices he overheard was the woman he loves. So it's all about a lovely 1920s sort of era airhead whose inheritance they plan to steal by declaring her illegitimate, which, I mean, that really doesn't come up again. Illegitimacy, that's something that kind of changed during this time period of people caring less about that. But a notable thing in this book is one of the characters has a job to work as a model or mannequin in a store. And that means that, when you go into a store, they have a plastic mannequin. What you used to do in some department stores is go in and somebody would walk out wearing the clothes and do a little turn for you, kind of like a fashion show, but just for you kind of thing. And then you would, they'd take your measurements or they'd have your measurements on file and they would make that dress or that outfit for you to your measurements and specifications. I guess the idea is that the dress is going to look so good on a mannequin or the model. These girls were often referred to as mannequins. So that used to be a job. Lauren Bacall, if you guys know the actress, she actually started out doing that as a job. So I thought that was just a really cool, little thing from history, that a job that we don't really know anymore. A girl in this book also works in a department store trying on hats for women, which is kind of interesting. It's the same thing again. She would come out, you would point out the hat, and she would try the hat on, and you would see how it looked on her. And I feel like that's really kind of funny because even in the book, it's kind of mentioned that the girl that's trying the hat on is very pretty and has a different face shape than the buyer. So the hat is going to look pretty because it's on a model, basically. And so it's kind of going to trick the person into buying a hat that doesn't suit them because they like how it looks on someone else, kind of thing. Anyway, that's just a little sort of side note that I found interesting. There are some funny jobs throughout history. So number 2, 1937, the case is closed. In this one, a young girl hops on the wrong train and finds a strange lady in her carriage who recognizes her from a recent court case. Her cousin, Marion's husband, has been jailed for murder, and the little woman on the train seems to know something about it. Hillary starts to look into the case against Jeff and knows that there must be a clue here to unlock who really did it. So basically, Jeff is in prison and Hillary, his sister-in-law, I guess, cousin-in-law. Anyway, the opening to this book is really, really good. Hillary is avoiding her fiance who she's fighting with. And it's like such a silly fight, and all the stuff on the train and all that kind of happens first. And then we find out about Jeff a few chapters later. So it's kind of delayed. He's already been in jail for a year. Yeah, it just is a really good setup in this one. Of course, the murder is over a will, or that's assumed to be the motive. But there is an interesting character called Bertie, who I think may be sort of coded as being gay, discreetly coded as gay. He's into embroidery and he only has women friends and he collects china instead of getting a job. So the uncle that was murdered, the person that was murdered, didn't like him, but now he stands to inherit everything. So there's this kind of shady thing going on. This is a nice little case, locked room situation, ne'er-do-well relatives living off allowances, that kind of thing. Very different time period. Yeah, the setup of how the murder is done is quite neat too. And something that came up was this idea of women's personality changing and their vibrancy being sort of crushed out of them by having an abusive spouse. And I think it's just such a good observation, you know, like an apt observation that you wouldn't necessarily see that described as much in some other books. It's like something that's not talked that much about the time period. Like, yeah. So Hilary also uses the word dreep to describe, I really love that word, to just describe like sort of dreary, droopy, sort of downcast people that she doesn't really want to talk to. And it seems like, I don't know, it's just a great word. I kind of love it. It's very evocative. I think this is one of the ones I liked quite a lot. So Lonesome Road is number 3, 1939. Beautiful Rachel Traherne, I think that's how you say that, must rewrite, why can't I say that today? Rewrite her will every year, deciding who gets her late father's huge wealth in the event of her death. So basically having to rewrite it was part of the, was like in his will that she has to do that. Yeah, but this year she gets a death threat in the mail and starts to wonder who she can really trust around her. So she turns to Miss Silver. Beautiful woman, an inheritance, woman in peril, classic Miss Silver mystery themes. Yeah, Miss Silver is more of a major player in this one, so she comes to the fore. It's a bit more like a traditional detective setting. It's a good little read. I like the large house and the all the different characters of the family that live there. I think that's very of its time to have a multi-generational home. And that was a lifestyle that was starting to shift at this point. So yeah, it's a cool book. Number 5, The Chinese Shawl from 1943. This is actually the first one that I got, which got me hooked. Miss Silver is staying at a country manor, helping resolve one issue when a murder occurs. So she's asked to stay on to help with the evolving case of a murdered RAF pilot and the beautiful heiress who has just met him and fallen in love. The country house belongs to Laura Faines, but it's always had her estranged cousins living in it. So she proposes that they stay on, but there's clearly a lot of family tension and pride here and that kind of thing. Miss Silver is in fine form here and gets a bit of screen time, so to speak. So it's one of the books that she appears in a little bit more. At this point, she's more fleshed out and developed here. Yeah, and there's a little bit of those war era bits and pieces. Yeah, all of the tropes are here and used to good effect. So 1944, we have the 8th book in the series. This is The Key. Michael Harsh escaped the Nazi concentration camps, but his wife and daughter were not so lucky. In England, he has worked to invent a new formula for an explosive, but the night he finishes it is also the night that he dies. Suicide is the verdict, but his friends at the War Office suspect foul play. Only Miss Silver can sort out the mess. While this is a war-themed story, and the way Harsh talks about his family and needing to speak about them even though they're gone without wanting to frighten the listener, I found that really touching. I just think like that's so true that when he's obviously Jewish and escaped to England, and I just think I love that he wants to talk about them and keep them alive, but that it makes other people uncomfortable. I think that's something that would have been really relatable in that time period and is relatable today. So I found that really moving, that little bit. We have the young secretary here, the young woman, and an issue with a will. The scientist's notes about his invention have been bequeathed conveniently for the enemy to this co-scientist who is a pacifist. So yeah, this one's a little bit more got a few sort of spy and thriller elements to it. Agatha Christie wrote a few like that as well in this time period. But this feels like a little twist on the genre. It's a Miss Silver twist on that kind of trope. Yeah, this one has quite a few little tidbits about the war, what it felt like to remain at home while other people are fighting in the war. This one has children sent to the countryside, the loose lips sink ships of it all. There's rationing, people who are not being called up and people who are. And then thoughts about law in England and the importance of that balance in the face of the madness of that sort of authoritarianism of the Nazi regime. So this one's a really fascinating snapshot of its time. Yeah, and the key of the title is referring to who had a key to the room where the murder took place. Yeah, so there's a little bit of, is somebody secretly a Nazi as well? So lots going on in that one. Number 10 is Pilgrim's Rest from 1946. When Judy Elliott takes the job as the new housemaid at the house Pilgrim's Rest, where the Pilgrim family live, Detective Frank Abbott gets worried since a series of deadly accidents happened there a few months previously, in line with an old superstition about the place, which is basically that if the house is ever put up for sale, the owner will die or something. Miss Silver is enlisted to go down to the quaint little English village to investigate. So we have wartime and avoiding the bombing in London. Frank Abbott here is in love with Judy, which is very cute. And we have a character called Jerome who has come back from the war with a disfigured face and what's described as shell shock. And it's really nice to see this taken face on and talked about, his reactions, how he feels, the horror of it all, and feeling like he doesn't want to frighten people with the way his face looks. So the way he's kind of depicted, he went over to fight in the war, and the darkness of what he saw has kind of become who he is a little bit. But then on the flip side, the little 4-year-old character in this book just asks innocent questions, and that kind of, like kids of that age just have this acceptance of things. So that really helps him find himself. It's a little side part of the story, but it's a lovely moment. And I think this would have hit home to a lot of readers at the time. It kind of recalls Shirley Temple's kind of the way she was used in movies. And this one also has cannabis indica in it, used to cause nightmares in a PTSD patient. And then we also have talk about women in the workplace, and how, women joining the army sort of bothers the gardener of the house because he's a little bit older and set in his ways. And this is kind of dismissed as like, ladies, if you go into the workforce, you're going to hear this from the old guys. They're just set in their ways. Don't worry about it, which was kind of cool. Meanwhile, we learn that Miss Silver's grandmother was actually a suffragette who believed in equality of the sexes back in the day, back in the Victorian era, it would have been. And she once offended the vicar by saying so, which I just loved that little side story within this book. This one was interesting because the ending gives us a solid answer to what happened, but it also leaves something open. So I kind of wondered, will we see these characters again? There's a few little sort of open-ended things there that kind of hint at maybe something like that. A couple of things in this ending that were a little bit different to other books. And I'm not going to tell you about them because that would be spoilers, but, it was good. Number 11 is Latter End, 1947. Lois is warned to beware of being poisoned when she visits a London fortune teller, and when she starts to grow ill, her husband contacts Miss Silver. Lois has manipulated her way into Latter End, her husband's ancestral home, and is making changes there that ruffle feathers. But when she's found dead, Miss Silver is on the case. So again, we have money and old homes, who stands to inherit, that kind of thing. This time we have Lois, who's a really interesting character. She's definitely a femme fatale, perhaps, whose manipulations and flirtations come home to roost. A little bit like one of the characters in the previous book, Henry, was kind of a fly-by-night type man where, that kind of came back to haunt him too. So yeah, here in 1947, we have a fashionable woman who sees the social whirl of life waking back up after the war, and she wants to be in on it. She doesn't want to be left behind, but she wants to leave behind, that life that she had to live during the 40s. So I think at this point, it's reflecting that it must have been a relief to return to some semblance of fun and normality and sort of society coming back together after the war years, and then being slowly able to get some luxuries and some normal foods again after rationing and things like that. Rationing in the UK, I think, from my understanding, lasted into the 50s. So yeah, I liked this one about Lois. She's horrible, but she's kind of great, if that makes sense. She's great to read about. Hated her. Loved it. So number 12, this one is from 1947. Over here, it's called Wicked Uncle. In the UK, its title was Spotlight, I think, or maybe it's the other way around. Gregory Porlock invites a strange assortment of guests to his house, none of whom seem to have much in common, until their host is found dead with a knife in his back and a note calling him out as a blackmailer. Is that what ties them all together? Only Miss Silver can solve the case in her inimitable style. This is another case with a big house in the country and a bunch of guests. Kind of reminded me of Clue a little bit, this one, for some reason. I love this kind of thing. This one works really well. Dorinda Brown is our young heroine, dragged in as the secretary of our humorously sensitive and dramatic Mrs. Oakley. So there's a bit of fun there. The wicked uncle, in this case, is her uncle who left her aunt, but would kind of swoop back in and into her life and take money when he was strapped for cash. So that's her wicked uncle, who plays sort of a part in this. This kind of struck me. Going back quite a few generations in my family, there was a relative who did this. One of my family members opened a little shop in her front room. I mean, this is in the Victorian era, in order to survive and feed her children. Her husband left her, but he would just walk in sometimes and take all the money out of the cash register and then disappear, and my mom found out about it through court records. And women didn't have a lot of recourse for stuff like that. You kind of just had to suck it up. And so that kind of struck me that was in this book in the 1940s. And the book also talks about the Women's Property Act, which sort of allowed women to own property. So there you go. Miss Silver, progressive. Number 13 was the case of William Smith, 1948. A man who has forgotten his life before the war, so he has amnesia. The woman down on her luck who comes into the toy shop where he works looking for a job, evil, grasping secretary, and the money mismanagement. They're all here, and we have mistaken identities as well. This one I really liked. This has sort of lovers separated and reunited. The characters feel really colorful. We have some people that are high society and some people that are working people. But there's a lot of affection between characters. It's just a nice book. And of course, we have the inheritance as the core of this. A little bit of a Cinderella feeling in this book for me. Not a lot of social security in this era, I suppose. And I was wondering if that sort of that thing of Hollywood often showed aspirational lifestyles at this time. So I was kind of wondering if that fed into, as I was reading this book, I was wondering if that fed into her choices to have these Cinderella type stories. I don't know. Anyway, moving on. Catherine Whale. This is number 16, 1949. This one's set in an isolated country inn, so it's a little bit different again. Disparate group of cousins, all descendants of one person, but they've all gone their separate ways. And there is, of course, the hint of a will that could be made. So there's money at the core here. And and then the Catherine Whale is the country inn's name. And there's secret tunnels and things because there used to be smuggling there. So this has kind of got that Smugglers in the Cove thing, which is wonderful. The atmosphere in this one is really nice. It's very kind of spooky. A lonely house, lugubrious atmosphere, and the inhabitants are all really strange. There's a lot of secrets and things. I think the story was a little bit more simple than some others, but not in a bad way. I like that one. 21 in the series. There's a bit of a jump here to 21. It was 1951. So in this one, Edward returns to his small town home called Greenings after having been presumed dead, to find that his uncle has inherited the entire estate that was meant to be his. So soon there are two women chasing him, one an old flame and one with a secret. And there's rumors of two wills. We got murder, and a murder or two, and blackmail. It's a tangled web. It's actually kind of hard to describe this one just in a couple of sentences because it's sort of a bit involved. But luckily, Miss Silver is in town to unravel the thread, coincidentally looking for just the right wool for her latest knitting project. So she comes in about a third of the way in. There's a little bit of a sense of humor in this one about there's a nurse at the house and she's a little overdressed and she doesn't impress the local ladies who dress a little bit more conservatively. So it's like we don't like her city ways, I guess. And then in contrast, there's Susan, who's a little shy and homely in comparison to this sort of flashy lady. So yeah, that was kind of interesting, that kind of use of clothing to kind of show personality, social class, that kind of thing. And here we don't know where our main character Edward disappeared to for quite a lot of the book. So there's a bit of an intrigue there as well, like what is he hiding? And then there's the grumpy, evil uncle who gives the whole thing a nice bit of sort of, what's this guy's problem? A little bit of intrigue. It's sort of... I like it because it's like a little bit too obvious that he's the killer, isn't it? Like, it couldn't possibly be him, right? Because it's so obvious. So this book mentions that Miss Silver has an old-fashioned home and clothing. So she likes those things that are sort of from her era. But she has a modern desk. And I like that because that really represents her work is very modern, but her outlook is very old-fashioned. And I kind of liked that use of... that like imagery to kind of to show that about her character, So as a governess, she would have lived in other people's homes and never had her own home, and she would have just retired on a pittance somewhere. I kind of mentioned this before, but it would have been a very sad retirement. And so this book kind of has a bit of description of her home and why that's so important to her, like her own home where she's in charge of her life. Her detective consulting means that she can have this. She lives in an apartment, by the way, which is kind of, apartments are for working ladies. So she has independence, meaningful, interesting work, money to retire on and live well. I love all of this stuff. So in some ways she's a jaunty modern woman, and in some ways she's very Victorian. And this is a very kind of interesting time for women, very post-war attitude to women and work. And I really love this. I think some of the earlier books were a little bit better than this one as far as plotting and story and stuff goes. This one's a bit convoluted, but I really liked it. Not one of my favorites, but I really liked it. And then the last one that I read is from 59, so a bit of a time jump again. This is number 30. So at a party at his country home, a fingerprint expert tells the story of how he once shared a bomb shelter with a man whose face he could not see because it was pitch dark, but who confessed to murder because he was so frightened he thought he was going to die. So he confesses to murder in the bomb shelter. While sharing a cigarette, our fingerprint expert was able to capture the man's fingerprint by sort of passing him the cigarette case and then wrapping it in a handkerchief, basically. But the man got out of the shelter and disappeared, so he never knew who it was. He just has his fingerprints. So when this guy is killed, his name is John, suspicion falls heavily on the niece, Georgina, for the murder of her uncle, because she did that classic thing of murder mysteries. She walked into the room and she picked up the murder weapon for some reason, and so, her fingerprints are on it. But the case has a lot of twists. The fingerprint of the murderer that was in the collection has been torn from the book that it was kept in. Her rich uncle had actually changed his will and not left everything to her as everyone thought. So is that maybe changes the motive of the killing? There are poisoned pen letters, threatening phone calls on the party line, no less. If you guys don't know what that is, back in the days of landlines, in the early days of landlines, there would be one phone line sometimes for a whole little village or a whole area or a street, which meant that anyone could pick up the phone and listen into your conversation. So loosely speaking, that's what a party line is. And Frank Abbott is staying at the country house just before the time of the killing, so we know Miss Silver isn't far behind. This is one of the later ones in the series, as I mentioned, And we've been a bit on, like throughout this, we've been on a bit of a walk through the changing face of England during the modern era of that country, from the late 20s through the 30s, 40s, 50s, and now into the early days of the 60s. There's mention of the fingerprints of infamous Nazis being amongst the collection in this book. And that kind of struck me because that would have such a different connotation now. Back then, it was a war memento, a reminder of what somebody had gone through firsthand. But now, if you have something like that in your house, it would be assumed that you are sympathetic to the Nazi cause. So I find that quite interesting. There was a great quote on in this book about books, which I want to read to you guys. They're talking about books and things. I really rather like Cinderella stories myself, said Monica Abbott, but I like them well done. And of course, sometimes they're just sloppy. But anyhow, I think they are better for you than the sort of gloomy book which goes on for about 600 pages and ends up with someone committing suicide or facing a hopeless dawn. Because really, whatever you feel like, in real life, you just have to get on with your job. I really like that quote because at the same time as I've been reading these, I have had a couple of those heavy 600-page books that are just kind of really heavy at the end, and you're just it's a slog to get through them. And I just thought that was such an apt little quote or a thing that she was talking about. And I mean, these books are Cinderella stories, and I just related to the character saying that. But I also found it comforting because this character was saying this in 1959, and I feel that way about some books today. And I remember thinking recently, like, oh, like books are going through a difficult time right now. Of like, there's a lot that maybe I don't really like, or there's a lot of those 500-pager, sad ending, depressing ones. But kind of knowing that it's always been that way made me feel a bit better. So thank you, Miss Silver, for that contribution to my life and my outlook. This book is quite entertaining. There's a character called Mary, short for Miriam, who's a manipulative liar. But also, this is part of her nature, and it's sort of explained that by pretending to sort of be innocent and non-threatening, that got rewarded a lot more for her, and she didn't have anyone that cared for her. So the way to get her needs met was by behaving this way. So it's not that she's a bad person or a manipulative. It feels like something she might grow out of when she's surrounded by better people. And often these books had those little insights into character of like the psychology of why someone might be that way, and whether that makes it, the reason why someone is a certain way makes it more or less forgivable. This one is darker, actually, than some of the previous ones. It definitely had more of a 1950s feel to it, for sure. There's a bad guy in this who's a bit of a teddy boy. So that was kind of new and different, that rise of the teenage culture of the 50s. So that's included. Miss Silver, by this point, is very out of time here. And the passing time is noted in her sort of out-of-date clothes and style, but age does not weary Miss Silver. She's awesome. So yeah, this one didn't have as much of a mystery. You know or can guess the killer by about halfway through, but it's more about the intrigue and the journey and how it's all going to play out more than a whodunit in this case. So I think it worked really well. I mean, I didn't really think about that until after I'd finished the book. So those are all the ones that I have read. I am planning on getting my hot little hands on some more of them, but I wanted to share those with you guys now. Have you read any of these? Have you heard of Miss Silver? Please let me know in the comments if you have. If you've read some of the ones that I've read, I'd love to know if your opinion is the same as mine or different. That kind of thing. So talk to me in the comments. I want to hear from you, and thank you for joining me. Thank you for watching this long video.